Welcome back this week to another episode of Fed Up Church, where we're fed up with the man-made traditions just as much as you are, and we dig into what the Bible actually says. So this week, we're in Ecclesiastes Chapter 8. Now, up to this point, we've seen Solomon, King Solomon, wisest man who ever lived, right? We have seen his approach with everything being meaningless, blah, everything's meaningless, everything's pointless, vanity of vanities, all is vanity. And we started to see what he meant by a lot of that, and what this preacher, Ecclesiastes, remember, translates as preacher, what he's saying we should derive satisfaction from, and, what happens when we derive it from the wrong things. We saw last week what happened, he started focusing on his many wives, right, and woman whose heart is a trap is worse than death, right, this idea, and that's kind of where we left off. And remember, he had 700 wives, 300 concubines. So it makes sense if the man was a little sour. But this week he's going to take an interestingly morbid turn. Stick with us as we roll into Ecclesiastes Chapter 8. Welcome back. So this week I'll be reading from the New International Version. Again, doesn't matter what version you use. I don't care. Follow along in whatever version you have. Blow the dust off the Bible and let's actually dig in. And I will say to everyone who's celebrating the resurrection this week, awesome. We just celebrated our first Passover Seder. I'm not Jewish, but reading through the book of Exodus, my wife and I were discussing it, and we decided, you know what, it really says to never forget the Passover for generation to generation forever. So why don't we celebrate that? So we did, and it's a long night, all night kind of thing. So this week's episode is brought to you by a ludicrous amount of caffeine. Unnamed bottle. They're not sponsoring this. Nobody is. So let's dig in. All right, Ecclesiastes Chapter 8. And I'll pick up in verse 1. Now Solomon says, "Who is like the wise man?" He is the wisest man who ever lived. And he's asking this question. Who is like the wise man? Who knows the explanation of things? So one, he's kind of alluding to either a wise man knows the explanation of things, or who is like the wise man who does? Because as the wisest man who ever lived, he doesn't. This is the struggle he's been facing this entire time. This is what he's trying to communicate to us, is that even with all his wisdom, there are certain things that are just unknowable. And if we could fit everything that God created and all of God's creation into our feeble mind, then that's not the God of the Bible, right? That's a God of our own imagination. That's a God after our own image. So he's saying, who is like the wise man who knows the explanation of things? Wisdom brightens a man's face and changes its hard appearance. So if you're looking to find somebody to learn something from, like Solomon did. I mean, he made a lifetime journey of trying to learn everything he can get his hands on. But we see that he says, okay, first of all, you have to know who a wise man is. How to identify somebody who has wisdom that you can learn from. Well, how do you do that? He says, wisdom changes their face. Literally, wisdom brightens a man's face and changes its hard appearance. It's no longer so angry. Why? Because that man has been enlightened. That man has learned. That man is cultured. He understands. And it tends to be that those who have wisdom tend to be a little bit more forgiving and more gracious. He's like, so if you're looking for somebody who's wise, start with looking at their face. The whole idea of we'll call it a resting mean face. That's the PC way of saying it. A resting mean face. No, he says that person probably lacks wisdom. Because if they were wise, you tend not to get so angry over so trivial of matters in life. And he says, the second verse here, obey the king's command. Obey the king's command, I say, because you took an oath before God. Now, keep in mind, back in Solomon's day, yes, they literally, during the coronation of a king, they took an oath. The people took an oath and the king took an oath, right? The king took an oath to protect and look after the kingdom, and, we kind of translate this today in presidential inaugurations, and you'll typically see them, like, up till recent years, it was always place your hand on a Bible and, I solemnly swear, and then it ends with, so help me God, right? They recently, I think I've changed that in most recent presidential election or two. I don't know. I don't pay attention to it anymore. Politics is such a waste of time. Both sides of the fence are just as corrupt. I have no time for any of it. And that's coming from somebody who was in politics for a little while. It's not worth it. Now, obey the king's command, I say, because you took an oath before God. The people took an oath too, right? To serve and obey their king as they believed that their king would serve and obey God, protecting them. So, having that understood, he says, listen to your king, right? Obey your king. Because you took an oath before God to obey your king. And we talked about this previous chapters about, like, don't be quick to vow anything before God, right? It'd be better to keep your mouth shut than to vow anything and then not pay up and not uphold your end of the bargain. He's saying, do not be in a hurry to leave the king's presence. Do not be in a hurry to leave the king's presence. Now, Solomon's talking about literally your king, whoever is over you and has authority over you. Obey them. Don't be quick to leave their presence. Do not stand up for a bad cause, for he'll do whatever he pleases. Since a king's... It's doing it again. Forgot to unplug it. Now we're back. Okay. Unplugged and not boiling water. Okay, where was I? Obey your king. Literally because he can do as he pleases, right? You took an oath before God. He took an oath as well. Just obey your king. Now, if you're not going to obey your king, be careful, right? Ludicrous amounts of caffeine. Nope. So if you took an oath before your king and before your God to obey your king, and then you don't, that's a fast way to have your head chopped off, right?
Bring me his head.
Right? That's what kings would do. They would cut your head off. Don't be fast to leave the presence of your king, right? To hurry out. And then the idea here, he says, since a king's word is supreme, who can say to him, what are you doing? If the king's word is the final authority, who can say to that king, like, what are you doing? And second guess him and question him. And this brings us to a very valid point. Now, we don't have necessarily kings and monarchs, especially in America, like the way we do then. I mean, we say that. We call them president, and we switch them out every 4 years or 8. But at the end of the day, I can't tell you the difference. It feels very similar. We just call ours freedom. So anyway, back on track. Who can second guess a king? If the king, you took a vow before God to follow the king, to obey the king. If the king gives you a command, who are you to second guess it? You're a little outranked. And this is the point that he's kind of bringing up and looking back, right? Remember, Solomon was looking forward a lot to the future too. We look back. So this is before Jesus came. Now, looking back, this passage has an entirely different tone to it, to me personally. Because the way I'm reading this, he says, obey the king's command. Now, I may have a president and not a king, but I serve a king. I serve the king. And he says, obey the king's command. What did Jesus command you? And this is where we're going to get into a sticky point for a lot of churches who like to preach isolation, who like to preach the ostracization, the ostracizing of groups from their congregation. What did your king command you? Because he said, literally, I give you a new command. Right? To love one another. That's something we don't talk about very often. If the command that Jesus came to give us, and he literally says, like, I give you a new commandment. Let me find it. Pause. Found it. Okay. John 13:33. I'll put it on the screen here. Make some room to put it right here. Okay. John 13:33. Jesus said, my children, I will be with you only a little longer. You will look for me, and just as I told the Jews, so I tell you now, where I am going, you cannot come. Verse 34 says, a new command I give you, love one another. Period. Love one another. Period. As I have loved you, so you must love one another. By this fact alone, the fact that if you show love to someone else, right, you love one another, love all people. By this alone, he says, by this all men will know that you are my disciples, if you love one another. What was the command your king gave you? And this is the question that I ask and bring back to a lot of churches who start preaching against people. You were never called to preach against the people. And they'll try and mask it, and they'll say, oh, I'm not preaching against people. I'm preaching against the sin. I'm preaching against that. No, careful. You're a sinner too. And when you forget that, you start saying things like you're preaching against the sin, and really you're just trying to gay bash from the pulpit or what have you. When you're preaching against people, my question for you is, what did your king command you? It's a command. It's not a request. It's not a, this will be nice to have. It's not a, you should do this because I think it's cute. Jesus said, this is a new command that I give you. That you will love one another. As I have loved you, you love one another. And by doing that, people will know that you're my disciples if you love one another. If you don't, you are not fulfilling the king's command. You're not doing your job, and you're not doing what I sent you to do. So, what did your king command you? Now, he says, do not be hurried to leave the king's presence. Do not be in a hurry to leave the king's presence. Man, I feel like that's talking straight to me half the time. We get so busy and we get so tied up dealing with everything that's going on in life, right? Like, even, yesterday as we're going through and getting everything ready for, the Passover meal, remembering the Passover. And as we look forward to the resurrection, kind of remembering that and celebrating that. What I find most problematic for me is I get so lost in the task day to day, getting things ready, making sure everything's organized, moving around, which most of the time is moving out of my wife's way while she gets everything ready, because she's awesome and she's an amazing cook. So, lamb was awesome. But I struggle with, even in saying prayers, like take 30 seconds, leave Jesus a voicemail. And that's kind of what it feels like. And this is why Solomon is reminding you, don't be in a hurry to leave the king's presence. It's a two-way street prayer, right? It's a two-way dialogue, and we need to be able to have that conversation with God and then give room to listen and not be in such a hurry to leave the king's presence. Slow down and take a moment and just be in the presence of the king. I feel like when we get to a point where we're no longer reflecting God's love toward others, that means we've gotten too far away from it. We've gotten too far away from him. We haven't been in his presence long, or we're in a hurry to leave the presence of the king. Don't leave the king's presence. And maybe you can reflect a little bit of love towards everyone around you. Because we say like we reflect God's love, but literally it's reflect, meaning you have to be close enough to allow it to hit you. And you got to stay there long enough to shine it off. Reflect God's love by staying in the presence of the king. So Solomon is giving us a little bit more wisdom than maybe he even realized here, looking forward as we look back and realize, especially this weekend, that each and every one of us has that ability. We have full access to the king. Something that most human kings, right? Most people would never have that opportunity with a human king. Maybe once in your lifetime, if you got lucky to petition the king and he would hear your request. And then whatever he said, the final word is final. But we have access to the king of the universe all the time. Solomon says, do not stand up for a bad cause. Do not stand up for a bad cause. The idea is don't be in a hurry to leave the king, but also don't stand up for the wrong thing, right? Don't stand up for rebellion against the king, because king will do as a king pleases, right? And king can kill you. God is not easily mocked. So we're given the same warning in Genesis and Exodus and Leviticus, Deuteronomy, the whole through the Torah, right? All the law is God is not mocked, and don't provoke him. It's not wise to provoke who can kill you. And he proved that many times, right? He created all of heaven and earth. Well, we are nothing compared to that. So he's saying, do not stand up for a bad cause, for he'll do whatever he pleases. So the idea, not to be quick to leave the king's presence, and then to not stand up for a bad cause, right? Don't go rushing out and rebelling against your king. He has the final word. And our king's final word was to love one another. So I don't care what it is. I don't care what your personal political allegiances are. I don't care what your personal beliefs are. All I know is what this book says. And this book tells me I am to love everyone, love one another. Every fellow human I am to show love to. Because God is love. If God is love and we are to reflect that, then are we reflecting his love? And if not, why not? Is it that we were in a hurry to leave the presence of the king and we stood up for a bad cause? And we stood up to question the king? We start second guessing the king? Start getting upset when the king's rewarding some other people and then not us because we think we're worthy of it and they're not, and vice versa. And this is where a lot of division and tension comes from. Trying to be better than other people. That's not showing love. That's animosity. And that's not what your king commanded you. Verse 5 says, whoever obeys his command will come to no harm, and the wise heart will know the proper time and procedure. Yeah, there's going to be times when the king makes a bad call, human king, makes a bad call taking care of his people. And Solomon, as a king, knows this. We like to think that these people, they're all wise, they're all knowing, therefore they had to make the right call. We forget, and we look even surgeons, doctors, I don't care what it is, you fill in the blank here, presidents, congressmen, They know what they're doing. Pilots, I'm on a plane. I trust that they're going to get me to my destination. They know what they're doing. But at some point, there's got to be some situation that they're placed in, just like us, every day where we look at it and go, like, I have no idea what I'm doing. And I'm just hoping to make it through. And I may make the wrong call. I might make a bad judgment call. If you're doing that as a leader of people, you put their well-being at risk. And he's saying, he's like, okay, there's going to be times when you want to second guess your king, but there's a proper time and a proper procedure for bringing that to a king's attention, somebody with that much power, because a king carries authority, they carry power, and you don't want to do it in the wrong way and get your head chopped off. Same thing for your boss at work. Any man who has authority over you, or woman, whatever, there's a time and a procedure. And man, I struggled with this. This is my biggest, I'll say, flaw early in my career. And I mean early as in like last week. This is something that is always something I have to keep in check. Because if I disagree with something anyone's doing, I don't care who it is, I don't care what level of authority they carry, my struggle has always been, I will say something about it. I will speak up. And I will debate and argue that point with you for an hour in front of God and everybody. I don't care. And there's a proper time and a procedure for doing that. Learning the appropriate time for those discussions took me a while. Because all you'll do is offend somebody with authority, and they'll chop your head off. I've been on the chopping block a few times. It's not fun. And again, there's a proper time and a procedure for it, right? There's a proper time and judgment that you have to use as to when you have these conversations with people. And he says, there's a way to do that with a human king. Now, if you're talking about the king, it's okay to question God. I've heard this last week. I heard a guy say that it is wrong to question God. I'm like, that man straight up called Jesus a sinner, because Jesus on the cross said, Father, why have you forsaken me? Why is a question. He questioned God, showing us it's okay to question. It's not okay to accuse God of wrongdoing. That's entirely different. And you can't go around saying that God is wrong, because God's never wrong, right? There's no wrong in him. He is all truth. He created everything. It's kind of hard to argue with the author of the book. But he's saying here, whoever obeys his command will come to no harm. So if you do what you're told to do, even when you disagree with it, as long as it doesn't go against God's commands, just carry it out. Just do it, and you'll come to no harm. He's not going to have you executed if you just do what you're told to do, because at the end of the day, you both swore an oath before God, right? That you're going to follow your king, and the king's going to follow God. And if this is what he thinks he's doing, you got to put your trust in who is leading you. And that's scary, and that's hard to do, especially with human leaders, right? If your leadership is, a boss, a president, it doesn't matter. You hope they have your best interests at heart, but you can't know that. So that's why he's saying the wise heart will know the proper time and procedure. For there is a proper time and procedure for every matter, though a man's misery weighs heavily upon him. Even if you hate the commandment you're told to do, do it. Follow the proper channels afterwards, but follow through on it. And we see this every day. People, I don't understand, people get into like fights with cops. 90% of the issues you see like recorded wouldn't be issues where like cops are like, oh, it's excessive force. Well, if the guy just did what he was told to do in the first place, right? Well, I don't believe you should have pulled me over. Okay, well, the cop believes you, and the cop carries authority by the law there, so you're kind of at a disadvantage already to begin with. If you're going to fight that battle, there's a proper time And there's literally a procedure for how to do that. And if they arrest you and it's a wrongful arrest, it's like a $2,500 award you get for a wrongful arrest. So shut up and let them do what they're going to do. And then fight the battle the proper way afterwards. Fighting that battle at 10 o'clock at night on the side of the street where lighting is dim and they don't know you're pulling out a cell phone. They think it's something else, and then harm comes to you. Follow the proper channels. It will work out better that way. Now he's saying here, since no man knows the future. Since no man knows the future, who can tell him what's to come? If no man knows the future, you don't know what the future holds. And that's what Solomon is saying here. Listen to your king. Follow those who have authority over you, which is something we see echoed again in Romans, right? Where we're seeing Paul says the same thing. Like, obey those in authority, right? Honor the king. Respect the brotherhood. Honor the king. And love one another. It's simple to say and harder to do. I understand that. I live that life. It's very difficult to do. But to obey the commandments that you're given, because you don't know if that commandment's a bad idea. You really don't. You may have your hesitations about it, but that doesn't make it a bad idea, because you don't know what the future holds. And that bad idea might just be what God put in motion to allow his plan to come to pass. And vice versa. You might think you have a great idea, but we often assume we know a lot more than we actually know, right? Like, we assume we know what's best in a situation. We assume that we are better than other people in some situations, and all of that factors into our thought process and our decision making. And as a result, you end up making snap judgments, going, that's a bad idea, that's stupid, this is a good idea, I want to go this route, we're going to go this route. Well, you're not the one in authority, and probably for a reason, right? Authority is granted to people for a particular reason. And it took me a while to look at it this way, especially like at work. You know, whoever I got as a boss, it was like one boss after another. I'm like, another one, another idiot. Here we go. This is going to be great. But it took me a while to, okay, let me give them a chance, because they were chosen for a position of leadership for a reason. And whatever that reason is, I'm not in that position, which means I have something I can learn from them. So shut up, buck up, and just try to learn something. Now, Solomon's going on saying that no one knows what the future holds. So you can't say whether it's going to be a good idea or a bad idea. And regardless of all of that, no man has the power over the wind to contain it. Other translations will say, no man has the power over the spirit to contain it. Wind, spirit, breath, vapor. All these words very similar, especially in Hebrew. Some of them are literally identical. The breath of God, the spirit of God, the wind of God, right? That's what Solomon's pointing to. He's like, you don't have the power. You don't have the authority. Not only over other people, but you surely don't have the power and authority to contain the wind or the spirit that is within you when your day comes. And in that day, a day of death, you don't have the power to stop it. When it's your time, it is your time. So whether it's a good idea or a bad idea, you can't fully know, because you don't know what the future holds. And even more so, if it's your day, there's nothing you can do about it anyway. You can't contain your spirit when God requires it of you. No man has power over the wind to contain it, so no one has power over the day of his death. And no one is discharged in time of war, so wickedness will not release those who practice it. Okay, break that down. No one is discharged in a time of war. You can be discharged before a war, right? Because there's no need of you. You can be discharged after a war, because there's no need of you. But as a soldier, you cannot be discharged during a time of war, right? That's called going AWOL. Like you're away without leave, right? You're just missing in action. You took off. But you weren't discharged. The king still commands that authority over you, and he's not going to grant you freedom to walk away from this cause that he has enlisted you to do. In the same way, you don't have power over when you die. You don't have power over death. You don't. Your king does. He's the only one who has defeated death. Jesus is the only one who overcame death. So, because there is a war going on all the time, a war between good and evil, a war between who we are, who we want to be. Because there's a war going on all the time, you don't get to take a break. You don't get to sit this one out. This is a battle we all have to fight. And it's a battle we need to actually fight, stand up for the right cause, not for any bad cause, as Solomon is saying previously, not to just stand up for any evil cause, but to stand up for a righteous cause, what we are called to do. And what is it that your king commanded you? I'll keep saying this until we actually get it right and get it ingrained. What is it that the king commanded you to do? Love one another. 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 Churches drive me crazy with this. To the point where I got so sick and tired and fed up, I quit. I quit. I was teaching Sunday school and loving every minute of it, and then what I would hear coming out of the pulpits killed me. And it destroyed part of my spirit. And I'm not going to allow ignorant preaching, uninformed preaching, traditional word of mouth passed down by the traditions of men but not actually are contained in this book. I'm not going to allow that to kill my spirit. And I'm not going to allow that to destroy my ability to follow what my king has commanded. So I walked away. And now we're doing Fed Up Church. So if you're finding any value in any of these, give me a thumbs up. I appreciate it. Lets me know I'm not alone out here. Since you don't have power over death, you don't have power over the day of your death. He says, as no one is discharged in a time of war, so wickedness will not release those who practice it. Wickedness is not going to give up, so why should you? If wickedness is not going to release those who practice it, the war is not over. And if the war is not over, we are still called to preach the kingdom of God, right? Isn't that what Jesus says? Because the kingdom of God is at hand, close by. It's here. We need to preach the truth of love, a loving God who sent his son, his only begotten son, to live fully human, fully God, die on a cross. Did nothing wrong to deserve it. Die on a cross. Be put in a tomb, and 3 days later be resurrected, conquering death in the grave once and for all. And what does the Bible say about all that? If you believe in Jesus and then do these things and make sure you do this and that and then and that, and you might go to heaven. No, it literally says, whosoever believes in him should not perish but have everlasting life. That's it. Put your faith and trust in Christ, in Jesus. If you do that, he says, if you love me, you'll do the things I command you. Well, what did he command us? What's the commandment? What's the new commandment? Love one another. We lose sight of everything. And yes, it's a book. It's a book. And this book looks big. And there's a lot in it. A lot of it's history, which matters because you have to know the history in order to know where we're going. If you don't know Genesis, none of the rest makes sense. I said this last week. None of the rest is necessary unless you have a full understanding of Genesis. There's a lot of stuff you can learn, and you can spend a lifetime studying this book and learning it. But at the end of the day, you can sum up the entire Bible in one word, and that's love. God loved us, and because God loved us, while we were yet sinners, God loved us, so he gave his only begotten Son, so that whosoever believes in him should not perish but have everlasting life. If you believe in him, you will not perish but have everlasting life. If you believe in him, you'll do the things that he commanded you. What did he command you? To love one another. If you're not showing love one to another, you're doing it wrong. You're doing religion. You're doing the rituals of men. And we have made this a path throughout history. We did this all throughout history, and we often did it in the name of Christ, in spite of the fact that he said not to, in spite of the fact that he said to love one another. It's frustrating. Frustrates me to no end. In verse 9, he says, all this I saw as I applied my mind to everything done under the sun. Remember, Solomon's been trying to learn and use his wisdom that God gave him wisdom, all right, because he asked for a discerning heart to tell right and wrong, to be able to better lead God's people. And God's answer to that was wisdom. So he says, all this I saw, and I applied my mind to everything done under the sun. There is a time when a man lords it over others to his own hurt. So yeah, there's going to be kings, and if they're doing things that they believe are right, we should follow them anyway, because again, even if we think they're wrong, we should obey our king. But at the same time, he says, I have also seen men lord it over other men to their own hurt. Pull rank on them, and it only eventually came back and hurt them. But it didn't hurt the person that had to follow it. It hurts the person leading. So if you're in a position of leadership, this is kind of a scary verse, right? Because at that point, I'm leading others. And I know this full well. I've led a team of 50 for the past decade. And every day you make decisions. And you believe you're making the right decision. A lot of times they have to be very quick, very fast, snap decisions with very little information to act on. And you have to make these decisions hoping that what you're doing is not endangering the people that follow you, that is in their best interests. But at the end of the day, if it was a bad idea, it comes back on me as leadership of these people. It doesn't come back on them. Everything, I was taught this early on, is everything rises and falls on leadership. And I kind of was like, I don't know about that. And yeah, I learned that along the way. Today I have a little bit more of I would say like a more, what's the word? Refined version in my mind is that everything rises on the people and falls on leadership. So if my people are winning and succeeding, they did that, all their own. They get all the credit because of what they achieved. They get this reward. Everything rises on them. When we screw it up, that's me. That's all me. That was 100% me. I'll own that. That's leadership. So does everything rise and fall in leadership? No. And if you're the kind of person that thinks everything rises on you as a leader, you won't be a leader for long. Leadership is a servant position. You have to serve others. If you're lording it over others, Solomon says, I've seen men do that to their own hurt. It only destroys you because nobody wants to follow somebody like that. In verse 10, he says, then too I saw the wicked buried, those who used to come and go from the holy place. Wait, what? Hold on. Wait, Solomon. You're saying what I think you're saying. I've seen these men lord it over others to their own hurt. But then he says, I have seen the wicked. I saw the wicked buried. Yep, so wicked people die. We got that. Those who used to come and go from the holy place. Like the temple, the church, the holy place. And Solomon's calling these people wicked to begin with, which we're all sinners, I get that, but he's saying wicked, like they're exceedingly sinful. And they used to come and go to and from the holy place, place of judgment, the place of the temple, right, place of God. Those who used to come and go from the holy place and receive praise in the city where they did this. So they used to go to and from church. Think about it, modern day, it would be to and from church. And receiving praise, and they die, they get buried, and they receive the praise of men for the evil deeds that they did in their own city. He says, I saw this, right, when I applied my mind to everything under the sun. He says, those who used to come and go from the holy place and receive praise in the city where they did this, this too is meaningless. He has said it before, he's saying it again, the praise of men is meaningless. It's not the praise of men we should pursue, it's the praise of God. But he's saying, I've seen wicked people, wickedly evil, harmful people that used to, go to and from the holy place, die and get buried, and their praises are sang in the streets, in the very city in which they did all the evil deeds and all their evil actions. Politicians are like that. A lot of politicians are like that. Every 4 years, how many times you hear, you don't hear anything. Nobody mentions God at all except like election year. And then all of a sudden, every politician's out there. If they're appealing to the Republican base, they're right. They're talking about God, and they get pictures of them going to and from the holy place. Solomon says, "Yeah, I saw them, and I saw them buried. They still died too. And then we praise their name in the streets. Nobody even remembers the wicked things they do. This is all meaningless." In verse 11, he says, "When the sentence for a crime is not quickly carried out," here's our downfall. "When the sentence for a crime is not quickly carried out, the hearts of the people are filled with schemes to do wrong." And this is why, if you have, death row inmates are on death row for 10, 15 years. You have free food and housing for a decade and a half. It's not real discouraging to other people. So if that's the worst that can happen, they don't see the end result of their evil deeds get punished. At least not quickly. So that men will then fill their hearts with all kind of evil schemes. It's not necessarily the best idea to stretch the punishment so far away from the sentence. They find you guilty, then it should follow shortly after. In the same way, we're like that too. We'll go down the highway, speed limit's 55, and we'll do 70. Because we can get away with that probably for a couple of years or so, until you just happen to, it's that day, and that cop was sitting right there. And he just happened to, got you on the radar. Comes and get you. Do you know how fast you were going today? Fast enough to get you to pull up behind me today? I don't know. But because we got away with it for so long, our hearts are emboldened by getting away with it, right? People will say things like, it's only illegal if you get caught. Now, it's illegal to begin with. It's illegal no matter what. It has nothing to do with getting caught. The fact that you got caught, it was only a matter of time. And the longer that time takes, the less worried you are about getting caught. And that's what Solomon's saying here is, I've seen people get away with some wicked stuff. But when the sentence for the crime is so far away from the punishment, people embolden themselves. People fill their hearts with other evil ideas because they don't see the end result. They don't see God punishing evil on this earth. And he's going to get into a little bit more of that here in the next couple verses. He says, although a wicked man commits 100 crimes and still lives a long time, I know that it will go better with God-fearing men who are reverent before God. Wisest man who ever lived. Everything's an under-the-sun premise. He's not even up to this first 5-6 chapters. Didn't even mention, eternity. Didn't even mention really God in the first 5 or 6 chapters. And now, because he's a man of science, and now he's getting to this point and he's saying, I don't care if a man commits 100 crimes. I know, and he doesn't necessarily say that verbiage very often. I know it'll go better for a man who fears God and reveres him, has a reverent respect and a fear of who he is. It'll go better for that man versus the man who doesn't have a respect and a fear of God. It's not about getting caught by other men. God catches every single one of these evil deeds you do, and because he sees everything and he's keeping a record of it along the way, Solomon says it would be better to just be a God-fearing man and do what's right than to just do wicked, evil deeds all the time. I don't care if you do 100 of them and get away with it. Eventually you won't. And when you don't, it's going to hurt. He says, yet because the wicked do not fear God, it will not go well with them. And their days will not lengthen like a shadow. Their days will not lengthen like a shadow. Yes, if you're standing and the sun's going down, your shadow gets longer. As the sun kind of hits it, shadow grows. The verbiage he's using here specifically, it's kind of a colloquial phrase, meaning that your time lengthens like a shadow. It would be like a shadow on a dial. Remember sundials? That's how they worked. Sun would hit it, and as it went, it would get longer until it came around that noon. It was a point and there was no shadow. And then it would get longer. He's saying, men who do evil deeds, you may not see them punished, but you shouldn't be discouraged if you're not seeing their evil get punished. Their days will not lengthen like a shadow. It won't go well for them. And saying that their days are not going to lengthen like a shadow, he means like you can't count on their lives to be like clockwork. You can't just say they're going to live until 80. Chances are they're not. And I mean, we see that every day. That's not a stretch of the imagination to understand. Do stupid things, play stupid games, win stupid prizes. You start knocking over like 7-Elevens and shooting up, liquor stores. It's probably not going to go well for you. You're probably not going to live a long life. But even if we don't see that punishment take place, Solomon says, I know it's not going to go well for them. It'd be better just to fear God. In verse 14, he says, there is something else meaningless that occurs on earth. Righteous men who get what the wicked deserve. Yeah, righteous men who get what the wicked deserve. This passage is taking a lot of things into assumption. And we need to talk about that. But let me finish. He says, this too, I say, is meaningless. There is something else meaningless. This too, I say, is meaningless. Vanity of vanities. It's all vain. It's all empty and meaningless. But most discouraging, I think, to Solomon's perspective here is when righteous men seem to receive the due reward for the wicked. The righteous are cut off early. And the wicked live a long life. Like that's something he pointed to in the last chapter. But is that the case? And if it is that a gift? Like, is that a gift of God? I mean, think about it. If God were to look at you like he looked at Job and say, he's a righteous man, I'd be afraid to screw that up. Like, take me out at the top of the game. Let's cut it short now. And we talked about this before. Why does he give, wicked people so much more time? So for them to come to terms with who he is and start to build that relationship and maybe repent and find salvation in Jesus. But the more they sin and don't see their sins punished, the more harder their hearts become. Which makes it more difficult for them to come to that recognition of who he is. And you'll find, okay, so the Bible talks about harsh words stir up strife, right? But a soft answer calms them. A soft answer kind of puts the fire out. In other words, de-escalate a situation. Don't go in charging, just firing people up. If they're angry, de-escalate a situation. Jesus gave us a commandment to love. If our commandment is to love one another, and that's not just you and everyone like you, that's you and everyone, period. Love one another. Wisdom shows as a change in a man's face. It softens his appearance. He has a softer answer. It's wise to reflect the love of God towards others. Doing that puts the fire out. If we can put the fire out, we might be able to have a conversation with people about the love of God. If we can't, and all we're doing is stirring up harsh words and strife from the pulpit, how are people going to listen? Does anyone really want to hear that? I don't, and I am a Christian. At least I try to be. Christian means Christ-like, and that's big shoes to fill. I don't feel comfortable really calling myself Christian because I'm not Christ-like. I'm a disciple. I try to study to show myself approved unto God, as it says in 2 Timothy 2:15. But I don't think I'm Christ-like. I can't get there. Not without his help. But I'll spend my life trying. So what's the answer? What do we do? In Solomon's perspective, if we're asking the wisest man who ever lived, what do we do? You've seen the wicked live long and prosperous lives. You've seen the righteous cut short. Then what do we do? And if we don't know which is which, and we can't really know which is good and what's not, what do we do? What do we do? And his answer, because he didn't know either. Like, wisest man who ever lived, and even he says it multiple times, like, I don't know, but this I do know. And then he goes on here, and he says in verse 15, so I commend the enjoyment of life. What do you prescribe, Solomon? What do you prescribe for us? The enjoyment of life. Enjoy your life. Because nothing is better for a man under the sun than to eat and drink and be glad. Eat, drink, and be merry. I used to hear this phrase a lot. There's more to life than eat, drink, and be merry. Y'all didn't read Ecclesiastes. Solomon says there's nothing else outside of eat, drink, and be merry. Because then joy will accompany him in his work all the days of the life God has given him under the sun. God gave you a certain amount of days under the sun. What you do with those days, that's entirely up to you. How do you find enjoyment in your work? He says, well, find enjoyment in life, period. Eat, drink, be merry, be happy. You have power and authority over whether you feel joy. And what you do to allow your spirit to feel joy. Is when you see the word rejoice in the Bible. It's really meaning to rejoy, to have joy again, to get that spirit of joy back. And if it's people that are taking and killing that spirit in you, move away from those people and then start showing love to others. Because, if people are doing that and killing that spirit in you, show love, right? Show love to them. But if that's not reciprocated, you're not called to have to stay in a bad situation. Move. Find enjoyment. Solomon says, I commend enjoyment. Eat, drink, and be merry. Because if you do that, then you'll find satisfaction in your work. If you're focusing on enjoying life outside of work, then you'll enjoy the work you do. But if all you do is work and you're miserable at work, and then you come home and you're miserable at home, what's the point? That's meaningless. There's no life there. If you're enjoying life outside of that, outside of whatever toil you do, it's easier for you to find satisfaction in the work you do if you're finding enjoyment from your life outside of that. So enjoy life. Eat, drink, be merry, be happy, be glad. Have a glass of wine or two. Like, literally, that's why the church tradition is that all alcohol is bad. And when we point to, Jesus drank wine. Oh, it was not wine. It was not alcoholic. It was more like grape juice. No. God, no, it's not. Okay, they knew how to make wine. It's not hard. They've been making wine for centuries, millennia. Making wine since Noah, okay, since after the flood. The reason why wine, I know, had alcohol in it, because it says wine makes the heart glad. Well, grape juice doesn't do that to me. But wine will. Wine is symbolic of joy. So when Jesus was drinking that wine during the Last Supper, what we call as the Last Supper before his crucifixion, he held up the cup and he said, "In this cup is a new covenant, right? A new contract I'm making with you, with mankind. So whoever partakes of this cup, right, this covenant with me, this communion, this common union." That's why when we talk about communion and they drink the like grape juice and a little tiny cracker, this is how we have manufactured faith and distilled it down. Literally, as God says in Isaiah, you've diluted God. You have diluted your faith, right? You water it down. You dilute it. You literally take wine and turn it into water. And he says, "I have come to turn water into wine." What's his first miracle? It's water into wine at a wedding, at a marriage, symbolizing his covenant relationship with us as the bride of Christ in a marriage, in common union with him, based on this new covenant of joy. When I understood this, it's so much deeper than just parlor tricks, smoke and mirrors, and illusions at a party. That's not what it was. Jesus literally turned water into wine for the purpose of undoing what we had done. We took the religion and the rituals of men and mandated it as laws to over 20,000 of them. No wonder no one knew what God was, like how that God is love. Right? Jesus had to come to clear the air, to turn the water back into wine, because we had diluted it down so much. And he did that just so he could have a relationship with you and me. He restored the joy. And he restored the joy in my life. I can say that 100%. I don't know where I'd be without him. Anyway. All right, verse 16. Solomon says, "When I applied my mind to know wisdom and to observe man's labor on the earth, his eyes not seeing sleep day or night," because that's what it would require to set your mind to understand all of creation, all of God's work, and all of man's work on the earth, to understand it all. Just using your head, just using wisdom, not sleeping day or night, right? Stay awake. Doesn't matter if you're awake around the clock working on this. He says, "Then I saw all that God has done. When I set my mind to focus, to know wisdom, to observe man's labor on the earth, then I saw all that God has done." When you look at how everything around us works, my goodness. Yeah, I understand like computers, right? I was a computer engineer in like high school. Programming, coding, did it all. And at the end of the day, I still had no idea how they worked. Like, I know it works because I use them. It's like my phone. I know it works. I use it all the time. How it works, I have no idea. But you don't need to know how. You just need to know that it does. In the same way that I don't know how the pilot's flying the plane, I just know that it is. Being flown just fine. It's going to get me there because I trust in the one leading it, the one flying it. I don't need to know how to fly the plane. I just need to know that I'm going to get to where I need to go. In the same way Solomon is saying, when I set my mind to understand everything of man's work under the sun, then I saw all that God had done. Because at that point, I can't fully understand or comprehend the stuff man has done. Like, I don't know how we turn zeros and ones into this and you're seeing it. I don't know how that works. I have a vague idea. Nope, no idea how it actually works. And if I can't understand that, and man made that, how on earth am I supposed to understand all that God has done? And this is what Solomon was saying. This is the point he got to. How am I supposed to understand what God has done? I can't understand all the work that man has done. And he said this back when this was written. Computers weren't around back then. There was a lot of other stuff that he was like still trying to understand, right? Because you can't be an expert in everything. That's not possible. Even if you are the wisest man who ever lived. Then I saw all that God has done. No one can comprehend what goes on under the sun, despite all his efforts to search it out. Man cannot discover its meaning, even if a wise man claims he knows. He cannot really comprehend it. So all the wise men who claim they know things, he said, no, they can't. He's like, okay, they may be a wise man. Right? They may think they're a wise man, but they may claim to know things, but I am literally the wisest man who ever lived, and I don't know it all. And if I don't know it all, I know you don't know it all. I don't think any one of us would claim to be the wisest person who ever lived, right? We don't have a written account of God granting us wisdom. But a lot of times we think we know a lot more than we actually do. We think we know what's best for us. So when we get this frustration of, well, the wicked get to live forever, and the righteous people are getting cut off early, or someone cheats and they get an A+, but I studied and I got a C. It's not right for them to get rewarded and for me to get punished. It's assuming a lot of things, right? And this is what it took me years to fully understand how much of what I thought I knew was based on assumptions that I had never questioned or challenged, right? They're assumptions because we literally just assume these things to be true without actually asking why or questioning it. And so I got to a point of question everything. Once I started learning and went through this thing with Genesis of everything I thought I knew, scientific method, right? Apply the scientific method to it. Everything I thought I knew. And what assumptions that was based on. Like, well, the world's 4.3 billion years old. Wow. How do you know that? Because carbon dating, fossils. No, dude, carbon dating doesn't work past 2,000 years, and every scientist knows this. We will admit this, just not to the general public. It's not commonly talked about. It's only valid for about 2,000 years, and after that, it gives you some wildly inaccurate estimates, right? Because it's based on the amount of atmospheric carbon and that was present at the time that thing ate grass or whatever it was that had carbon in it. So where do we get these time frames from for 4.3 billion years? Everything I had thought I knew was based on assumptions. It was an assumption that, well, in order for evolutionary theory to be true, it has to be old. Has to. Billions of years old. Has to. Otherwise, evolutionary theory doesn't work. I'm like, wait, that's the reason. Like, that's what we're getting to. Like, that's actually legitimately the strongest defense we have to say that the Earth is this old. Yeah, it just has to. That's a big assumption. That's assuming a lot. And if we're going to assume that and base everything else off of that, then I have concerns. And that's where we start questioning everything. Solomon's saying that, yeah, you're going to assume that what you did is righteous, or what they did is wrong, or that you also assume like that you know better. Even if your king commands you to do something, you want to rise up and question him, assuming that you know better than the king. And how often do we do that with God, with our king? How often do we want to stand up and be like, no. I deserve this blessing, so I'm going to ask for this blessing. They deserve to be punished because they treated me wrong. They cut me off in traffic. They deserve to have a bad day. You're assuming you know everything. And a lot of times you don't know everything. 100% of the time, you don't know everything. You can never know everything. And if the wisest man who ever lived says, I don't know it all, how can you know it all? That's a clue. So we need to recognize we don't know everything, and we're taking a lot of things under assumption. So this week, question everything and ask yourself, what am I assuming in this scenario? If I find myself in a situation and the first question is, am I doing what my king commanded me? Am I showing love? And if I'm not showing love because I'm angry, I'm frustrated, I'm upset, why? What assumptions is this emotion being built off of right now? Because it's being built off of an assumption that I am better than this person, so I shouldn't have to wait. Somebody cuts me off, I assume it was a personal attack at me. It might be that they have to get their wife to the hospital, she's in labor. You don't know, you can't know everything. So what is this emotion based off of? And if you start to question everything, you'll get to the point of, okay, it's impossible to know everything. If it's impossible for me to know, I just have to trust the king made the right call. The king put me where he put me. The king ordered me to do what he ordered me to do, and I have to trust the outcome to the king. So trust your king. I love you guys. I'll catch you next week. I'm going to sign off, and I'll see you guys when we dig into Ecclesiastes Chapter 9 next week.